I think we can start. Well, good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon, Tony. I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm the director of the Federal Trust, and we're very pleased this afternoon to be hosting a webinar, which will be addressed by Tony Czarnecki, an old friend of the Federal Trust, who describes himself as an economist, a futurist, and the chief executive of Sustensis. He might like to say a word about the activities of Sustensis. But Tony is going to be talking this afternoon on a subject of which the Federal Trust very much approves. What is going to be the nature of the future European Federation? Notice he takes it for granted that there will be a European Federation. The question is, how will this be structured? And that's very much a framing of the question that naturally the Federal Trust entirely approves of. So Tony's going to speak for about half an hour. If you have questions or observations, please put them on either Q&A or chat, and then I'll act as moderator for them when we have a conversation with Tony afterwards for perhaps 45 or 50 minutes. Tony, thank you very much for joining us. Would you like to begin by telling us what you mean by federalism?
Well, it differs from confederalism that you essentially, as a state, lose sovereignty. And that is a big, big if for countries like Britain, but not only Britain, some countries in the European Union, like Denmark, Austria, are a little bit apprehensive about joining the EU or the European Federation. Therefore, as I will present in my presentation, this is not the foregone conclusion that the European Federation, if it comes into existence, will include all the current members at once. But I don't want to preclude my conclusions. I would like to address them bit by bit, my arguments. And you are right that I am perhaps now in a much more optimistic mood than perhaps I have ever been about the European Federation finally come into existence, for several reasons about which I will be talking in a minute. So thank you, Brendan, for introducing me, and let me go straight to the presentation, if I may. Sorry, I took it again. Yes, I perhaps should, sorry, what's this? I wanted to start from the first slide. Right, okay. Yes, the title of my presentation is What Kind of Federation for the European Union? And of course, as Brendan said, the assumption is that such a federation will indeed be created. Before I go forward, perhaps a question. What is the taboo word in the European Union? Since you are not directly connected, that's for me to answer it. And that taboo word is, as you probably have inferred, federation, which has been substituted by the euphemism an ever closer union. Well, I think we no longer can, and sorry, I perhaps made an explanation that when I say we, I still think that we are in the European Union, because I cannot accept the position that is now the reality for almost 2 years that we have left the European Union. So sooner or later, I think we'll be there as well. So pardon me if I use we, meaning that we also are part of the future European Federation. That's a long explanation. Anyway, the EU can no longer delay federalization for 3 reasons. The first one is, and you may have not noticed it, which will be very, very understandable, because we humans cannot imagine that pace of change can be other than linear, whereas these days, in many areas, including politics, change is almost exponential. And think about these 3 domains of human activities, which shows that really for the last 10 15, 20 years, this progress in these domains is almost exponential. But perhaps the best evidence of that was when we had pandemic. Have you noticed, did you notice how fast the world has changed in just 1 year? Think about working from home. Think about the education, that suddenly it was possible to teach even small children remotely. I'm not advocating, I'm only saying that these possibilities, which would have been deemed possible in perhaps a decade, were suddenly available. That was just within 1 year. And the empty high streets, and then the collapse of the retail as we know into the online shopping, all within just 1 year. And now the second example, we have the war in Ukraine. How the world has changed in just 1 month. And that's what I said. I'm talking in a much more optimistic mode right now about federalization, because the war in Ukraine has created new possibilities. Ukraine are paying with their blood for us coming to some extent to our own senses. So I would end this slide with this motto, which you perhaps be right to remember, that what once took a decade takes a year now. And we are talking now about politics, so this is very right to mention it, because I'm talking about federalization happening very, very soon. The second point I would like to make, the second reason why the European Union has to move fast towards federalization is that the man-made existential risk may require very fast response by global powers. Let me give you this example. In 2008, the Oxford Institute of Future for Humanity created this 8 main man-made risks. This table tells you that if you are not careful, and if you combine all those risks together, then there is 1 in 5 chance that all humans will be gone by the end of this century. But that was in 2008. Since then, the situation hasn't improved, if you like. The risk is not lower, it is higher. But perhaps more revealing is this comparative table created in 2020, which shows that the biggest risk of all man-made risks, I mean, these risks would not have existed before 1945. They are all created after the Second World War. So the biggest risk here is the unaligned AI, which means the artificial intelligence which is not aligned with our values, with the way we conduct our life, and with our preferences. We think that when we talk about existential risk, people normally think about something like an asteroid hitting the Earth. But total natural risk are just a sliver of the risk in unaligned AI, or even climate change. This is climate change, which is the most common man-made risk that people think about, is, believe it or not, quite a small one in comparison to unaligned AI. The human extinction caused by AI is 100 times higher than climate change, and it may happen much earlier. Actually, to take the things very brutally, we will not perish this century because of climate change. It is physically impossible. It will be very, very hard to live towards the end of the century, but humans would survive. Whereas with AI, it may not happen. So I'm not forecasting here a kind of a Cassandric development of events. I'm just quoting science and high probabilities, how badly the things may go in the next decades. So what is another thing to remember is that both AI and climate change have a tipping point about 2030. Just in a decade from now. So When you step back, you can see that both the EU and the world may lose control on the human's future. And that's probably the cardinal conclusion that one may say. So whenever you hear the politicians say that, oh, in a few decades we'll have this and that, remember that. There may not be few decades as we envisage here. They may be dramatically different, and they will be. So why is the EU vulnerable to existential threats? After all, the EU is the third global power. It also is the third largest spender in defense. However, this joint military action, like a lack of cohesion in foreign affairs, not only Hungary and Italy, but other countries, and slow decision-making with China, USA, and Russia, prevent the EU to play a global role. Why is that? I believe that EU's Achilles heel is a division of powers. Think about this, that this is a confederation of 27 governments, 27 country states, which are represented by the prime ministers or presidents in the European Council, 27 members. The European Council elects for 2.5 years European Council President, Charles Michel, currently. So we now have the first president, but that's not all. Every 6 months, the Council elects one of their peers as the chair of the presidency. We have a European presidency. This time, it's the French turn, and Monsieur Emmanuel Macron is the European presidency chair. And then we have national elections to the European Parliament. We get 7 and 5 MEPs for 5-year term. And the European Parliament elects for 2.5 years its own president. So this is the third one, currently Roberta Metsola from Malta. What happens then is that the European Council, in consultation with the European Parliament, identifies so-called Spitzenkandidat. They didn't go that way the last time when Ursula von der Leyen was elected. But anyway, she is now the European Commission president. So this is the 4th president. So no wonder that when the American president calls the EU, he asks, which president should I call? And it's still the case. And the European Commission president selects its commissioners, her commissioners in this case, which are approved by the European Parliament. The Commission may make legislation proposal, and so can the European Council, which are approved by the European Parliament. However, what also is the Achilles here in the European Union is the split of competencies. For instance, the European Council deals with taxes, social security, foreign affairs, and so on. The European Commission with customs, single market. And then there are subsidiarity issues regarding the shared competencies. There are over 50 agencies, such as health, transport, and so on. So you can see this is a real mess, and something has to be done. But what? 3 years ago, when I published my book, Democracy for a Human Federation, I did this table. It started in 2019 and went beyond 2040. And I split this scenario, the 3 scenarios that I'll be presenting, into 2 periods, till 2030 and 2040 and beyond. In the first scenario, which I titled Pre-Planned Orderly Transition of the European Union to the European Federation. So this is how the European Union has been getting ever closer to the ultimate goal of federation. we would start with the conversion program, new charter of universal values and responsibilities, new constitution, then ratification process, and we would have the European Federation created with no zones. This was a dream of Mr. Donald Tusk, the former president of the European Council, and Mrs. Merkel. We are all in it together, and nothing happened. And if you remember, dear Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, in 2017, he was proposing something entirely different, together with Mr. Macron. But unfortunately, Mr. Merkel did not agree. And that's why we are, to some extent, in the mess that the European Union is. Then the second variant is that there is a sudden push towards a transition into the European Federation, mainly based on the members of the Eurozone. There is an Article 20 of the Lisbon Treaty, which allows more than 9 members, if there are more than 9 members, to create their own, if you like, mini union, which can go further than the standard European Union and federate. That's the basis on which the Eurozone was created. So that would only apply, that would not only apply to the European members which are in the Eurozone, because not all of the members of the Eurozone may actually want the federation, and some members outside the Eurozone may want it more than those which are already there. So what we would create, or what would be created, are at least 2 or several zones. That's exactly the model that Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker had in his 2017 September speech. The first scenario is that the European Union simply collapses. The European Union splits into a European state, perhaps formed of a few countries, and the leftover zone. That would be a dramatic event, not just for the European Union, but for the whole world, because of the potential role that the European Union, the European Federation, could fulfill in such a perilous period that we are now. I mean, this decade is probably going to be the most perilous in the history of the human beings. I'm not saying it lightly, and I try to perhaps document, if I may, in the question and answer session, if anybody wants to know more about that. So we had now the war in Ukraine, and its impact, as well as the impact of COVID, changed everything. So now I would no longer talk about this red line, that means the date by when the European Federation should come into being. I would move it to 2025. Therefore, this is the date which I would suggest is the cutoff date for the European Federation to take charge of this perilous period that we are in. And we are lucky because, in my view, we had 3 very important events happening almost at the same time, which all play into the European Federation coming into existence. The first thing is that we had French elections, and Mr. Macron became the president. And then we had that, or we have that unfortunate war in Ukraine, which has focused our minds on really important longer-term issues, like the relationship with Russia, NATO, and so on. But perhaps the most important element is the third one. It's the Conference on the Future of Europe. I think that most of those who are listening to this presentation have heard about this, but I can make a bet that perhaps less than 1 in 10,000 people in Britain, or even in Europe, have heard about this conference, which was going on for a whole year and ended on the Europe Day on the 9th of May. Why? Because the politicians don't like it at all. They were doing everything for 3 years when it was first initiated in 2019, but because of COVID, it was postponed. because they know they will lose a lot of their powers. The reason behind that is that the Eurozone mainly put into existence because of the pressure by some NGOs and the federalists in the European Union, who insisted that the citizens should be closer to the power sharing, if you like, in the European Union. And that's why in every of the 27 European countries, there were citizens' assemblies which were created of randomly chosen citizens. So in each country, you had perhaps dozens of citizens, and then these assemblies elected or selected 4 of their representatives to the European Citizens' Assembly, which was part of the conference plenary. And apart from that, there was a large, very efficient and effective digital platform created by the European Union, which enabled tens of thousands of academics, scientists, researchers, and anybody that wanted to participate in that conference digitally by providing input in 10 different areas. I myself provided 11 proposals in the area of European democracy. One of my proposal was to create the Citizen Senate, and along perhaps thousands of other proposals by other participants that made it into the final report. And that final report, which is a very thick, over 100 pages print, and there are appendices to that, all those proposals in some way are there. So anybody that wants anything can find something for him and can reject the rest. That may be the end of it. However, we have President Macron holding the European presidency till the 30th of June. And I'm sure that he will make everything possible, because that is precisely his role as the presidency chairman, to direct the European Council for the next years what to do with that report and how to shape Europe. That was thought out, I think, 3 years ago, because he knew the French election coming there and so on, and he was aiming to be the French president and take it into his own hands. So that's why there is a lot of very good events coming at the same time. So the European Council will debate that report and will come up with an action plan in the autumn this year. And what can come out of that is either a push for the European Constituanta, which will develop the Constitution of Europe. This is my scenario 1, with no zones, that all 27 members will go on, and then over the period of 5, 7, maybe 10 years, will deliver the European Federation. In my view, this is a fantasy. It won't happen. I think it may be going on as a parallel process to the second scenario, which is a federated Eurozone. And that is, I think, what Mr. Macron meant in his inaugural speech after the delivery of that report, ending the conference on the future of Europe. Such a federation can be created, as I said, by a minimum of 9 members. Why? Because the European Union cannot procrastinate and cannot go on into the period of several years discussing all this. It has to be accelerated significantly, and I think it will. Well, read my lips, and you can test me in a few months or perhaps a year or 2 time. So why do I think that scenario, the second scenario is more likely? First of all, as I mentioned, Mr. Macron has won French presidential election. Then we have this Russian and Chinese threat, which, as you can see, is no longer theoretical as far as Russia is concerned. So it is easier for the politicians to convince the voters to the EU's own army. And then the mutual debt is necessary to finance the European programs. We have it for climate change, for health. We have it for common energy purchase and probably for defense. It all requires mutualization of debt, which means that we are all in it together and all the countries will have to sign up to it, like in the state. The most likely outcome is that the Eurozone will become the European Federation. I'm giving it in quotes because it will be Eurozone plus something or the Eurozone plus minus several members. So it will have its own constitution and the revised Lisbon Treaty for the rest of the EU. And that's what I meant, that the effect of the report that was just published would be that it will be a kind of a parallel activity for a different, as Mr. Macron said, the European political community, which will be a diluted version of the current European Union. So what kind of European Federation? Let me answer that. Or refer to the former Prime Minister of Italy, Enrico Letta, who said 3 days after the conference, well, let's make the European Union the European Confederation, which it is, but make it in the name. So that will be a contested name for what Mr. Macron proposed, European Political Community. Whichever name is chosen, I think that is very likely. That's what will happen to the current European Union, to those 27 members, and perhaps 28. Croatia is joining Eurozone next year. Sorry, yes. So what I envisage is that the European Federation state will come into force within the next few years, mostly consisting of the current Eurozone members. And then we'll have the laggards, or those which are outside, mainly outside the Eurozone, which I think will remain in a kind of a confederation convergence area, waiting for the right time for them to join. The Zone 2 would be the European Confederation Single Market area, for instance, European Economic Area, like Iceland, like Switzerland, and so on, and Norway. Most EU candidate members, including the Ukraine, might join that area by 1st January 2025. Why I'm mentioning 1st January 2025? Because the elections to the European Parliament will happen broadly in 2024. And if the new constitution for the European Federation is in place, then the European Federation president will probably start acting on the 1st of January 2025. This is just a possibility. And then the third zone, the European Confederation Customs Union, which we are familiar with, for new candidate members, and those which are already linked to the EU with special treaties such as Canada, Japan, or Australia. And then the United Kingdom, as usually sitting on the fence, either joining this Zone 2 or Zone 3. In my view, by 2025, we will certainly, almost certainly, be in one of those zones. And finally, Zone 4, the European Confederation Association area, believe it or not, there are already 30 countries in it. And progressively more nations outside Europe, far outside Europe, would become members of the European Federation by 2040 and beyond. So that is my vision, what may happen. And this is the route to the European Federation, starting with Zone 4 to Zone 3, 2, and then convergence route. The European Federation will have all the prerogatives of a state, like the United States, and some people call it the states of the European state. Yes, this is quite likely, and these are typical prerogatives of such a federation. What role then in the world for the European Federation. I think it must become more responsive to existential threats. I mentioned artificial intelligence, I mentioned pandemics, and the climate change. But then we have to take account of what I have been very insistent from the very beginning about the nearly exponential pace of change. Just imagine this, that in roughly 11 years' time, whatever happens now in any domain will happen 1,000 times faster. You don't believe me? Then go back 10 years and think how long it took you to cash a check. Several days. Now you can do it in seconds. That's the proof of things to come, which on its own may soon lead to existential global disorder, because people wouldn't cope simply with the speed of things happening. This is already on the agenda, that the mental health is one of our key worries, maybe from that reason as well. So the EU must decide or the European Federation must decide its role in the world. And there are two options. One, when it's federated, it mustn't take care just of itself. As the war in Ukraine shows us, the United Nations, unfortunately, is rudderless and it's completely disempowered. So there has to be some organization that will fill the void. I'm not saying that it will replace completely the United Nations, but that it will act as a de facto world government, encompassing the majority of the states, but not all. So that's one potential role for the European Federation. Or the second one is perhaps much more pessimistic, a kind of a coalition of the willy-nilly. Which one of the scenarios will actually be fulfilled, we shall see in a few years' time. So finally, we have to think about the future federation that must rebalance the power of governance by merging representative and direct democracy into what I call consensual presidential democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Much to think about. First question or objection I'd like to put is that while I can imagine that in the next round of intergovernmental negotiations, outside events will press the European Union into a much more integrative posture, probably, as you say, based on the Eurozone. I can't imagine that in the foreseeable future, it's going to be as tidily set out as your zones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can imagine an acceleration of integration, particularly around the Eurozone, but I think it will be much messier than that outside the Eurozone. And the reason why I say that is I think you have to underestimate the necessity of political will and concentration that will be necessary even to bring about your first zone, let alone the other 4. Can you just answer that, and then we'll get on to some participants?
Yes, absolutely right. Please bear in mind that the naming convention, even the number of zones, this is just an exemplification of what may happen. As I said, in the last few days, just after the end of the conference on the future of Europe, quite a few leaders were presenting their own view where to go next. So the former Prime Minister of Italy, Letta, suggested to call it the European Confederation, in contrast to Mr. Macron's European political community. And so it is with the zones. But whatever happens, Mr. Macron signaled very clearly that he thinks about the zones. He thinks about the area for countries like Ukraine to enable the Ukraine to come in rather early than later And in order to do that, the treaty has to be revised. He said, within this text, there is no way that the Ukraine can enter the European Union in the next decades. So that indicates a clear direction, at least of France, and France is an undisputed leader now within the European Union. I would say.
Well, I'm not sure that people in Warsaw would agree with
that.
No,
Yes, but I think that's what has come out, because Germany has unfortunately made its own go, as happened with the Ukraine and in the energy policy. So that's why I would say that it is not so important to reiterate that there must be 4 zones on these names. This is irrelevant. It's the overall concept of zones within Europe, European Union, and we already have that. We have European zone and we have Schengen, so we are already in that mode. The question is to go deeper and reaffirm the existing trend towards much more closer union, i.e., how close can you go than the becoming a federation?
Good. Well, there are a couple of questions. Some people have raised their hands, but it will be easier if they were to put questions or contribute to the chat room. One particular question that's been raised is the position of Hungary within the European Union. Doesn't that suggest the capacity of Hungary to go very much its own way over the past 10 years? Doesn't that suggest that the sort of federation you're talking about, the sort of rapid reinforced integration, will be very, very difficult, given that Hungary and other countries have a veto on treaty change?
Yes, for the same reason. This is exactly for the same reason as you mentioned, that countries like Hungary or even Holland and perhaps Denmark, that's not going to be for them. They would prefer to stay perhaps within the current shape of the European Union. I would remind you, you mentioned Hungary, but I think retrospectively, even the worst case we had with Mr. Berlusconi and Italy. How on earth could the European Union allow the president of Italy, the prime minister of Italy, to create laws for himself? And I mean, this is shattering. When we think about something like this being unnoticed, I mean, this is how the politicians work. And perhaps I speak emotionally, but really comparing with Hungary, what is happening now in Hungary, the situation in Italy was even worse because we let it happen. So there will be countries outside the future federation. And I think people like Mr. Macron have enough of that. Some people are impatient, and Italy has changed dramatically under Mr. Mario Draghi in a positive way. And they also want very firm push towards a federation. They don't use this word, but that's what it really means. When Mr. Macron mentioned the dilution of the European community, which is more or less what is happening, what the European Union is about, that's the indication that the other way is towards the federation.
But you use the phrase, we let something happen, or we can't let something happen. The people who are going to do the letting or the not are themselves politicians. Now, you may admire the individual Macron and Draghi and perhaps Mr. Scholz, but there are a large number of people within the European Union occupying important, influential posts who really will not see things in the way that you do. How likely is it that in the relatively short period of 3 years, it will be possible to overcome all those hesitations and reticences?
Well, first of all, Mr. Macron used the conference as a tool to attain his objectives. This is very clear. He wanted to use the argument that the citizens are perhaps staying away from the democratic process of participating in the European elections because their vote doesn't matter anyway. And that's why he has come up, not directly, but but let it happen, if you like, through Mr. Verhofstadt, who was the chairman of the conference, that the citizens are his, if you like, in quotes, weapon to deliver what politicians would probably never dream to deliver, or would be afraid to even spell it out. And that's my greatest hope, that if the European Union stalled on those reforms, there can be a real revolt in Europe among the citizens, because there are perhaps 1,000 NGO organizations in Europe which stand behind that process. It's not simmering, it's not in the media, because the politicians control to a large extent media. We have democracy, but this is not true. We know that media are controlled by the politicians. I'm straightforward, no political correctness. So that's why I think in the end, the push will be there. And then we have external pressures like Russia, the war in Ukraine, China coming up, and so on, energy market. Yeah, so it has to be done by a state. It cannot be done by a confederation.
But you yourself said that perhaps only 1 in 10,000 people were following the work of the conference, even within the present EU. I wonder if the findings of the conference will ever be the basis of a popular revolt against the politicians who might be worried about and skeptical about your idea of Europe being divided into zones. My impression is that Germany in particular still continues to be hostile to the idea of Europe divided into zones. And particularly, perhaps they would be worried about losing those Eastern European, those Central and Eastern European countries, for which reconciliation with Germany and Germany's reconciliation with them is very important in German politics. It's also true, of course, that the German government, even Mr. Scholz's government, has rejected the idea of a separate European budget, a separate Eurozone budget. How are these difficulties going to be overcome, do you think?
First of all, about those 1 in 10,000 people knowing anything about the conference, you're absolutely right. But as I say, it is a tool for Mr. Macron to get those policies that were defined by, say, mostly citizens in that report into the council, and now the real battle will come forward. And that's when the citizens and the media will start talking, because now the leaders will have to make their stand, which side they are on. And that will perhaps create a crisis. I'm almost certain it will be a crisis, because there are so many, as you say, so many countries, or so many politicians rather, that are against the ideas. And therefore, by the end of autumn, we'll know whether these 27 statesmen agreed to go together very fast. It's still possible. Or some of them say, thank you very much, this is not accepted to us. We have to get the things in our hand, and therefore we create a tighter, within the European Union, a tighter zone, which may not be called even a federation. I think it may be called something like the European political community, or whatever. Not to use the word federation, because whatever happens in fact, that will be a federation. I can't see any other way. It will be a clash. And that's when the media and the average Joe Bloggs will hear about the possibility of Europe being federated. Okay, we in the United Kingdom are the bystanders, but at one stage it will affect us as well.
But won't Joe Bloggs and the media throughout the European Union be affected by the framing and presentation of the narrative and arguments coming from the political class in those individual countries? How are you going to break through the political class and the media class, which are interacting, to get to this will of the people?
Yeah, I was expecting a challenging question, and here it is. I still put some faith, not a lot of faith, but some faith in those who were in those 27 countries behind the conference, the Citizens' Assembly, because in the document, it says that not only the European Citizens' Assembly as a kind of a Senate should be created as the second chamber of the European Union, apart from the parliament, but that in every country, you will have a Citizens' Assembly called several times a year to debate critical issues. So now you are talking about a battle between the politicians and citizens in each country. And I think it is very right to do so, because citizens' assemblies represent direct democracy in the most aspiring way. This is the cleanest way when you can marry the representational and direct democracy into a kind of a social consensus on a large scale. I know that, it looks like a devil initially. What? The politicians will have to talk to citizens randomly selected. But the referenda should be gone, because this is the populist tool. And Citizens' Assembly very nicely will fill in this void and will complement what politicians are for. They are for delivery of the agreed policies. But some of those policies have to be checked within the electoral period by the citizens, the representatives of the citizenship at large.
You've rightly quoted the template from Mr. Macron, which is essentially a plea for a zoned European Union. Aren't there quite powerful voices speaking against that in Germany, Italy, Poland, probably? Where would the support come from Mr. Macron for this radical change?
Yes, the changes that the European Union faces, similar changes are in almost every European country. Think about Finland and Sweden, suddenly within a month becoming the candidates of NATO. Unthinkable. For the whole period of the Cold War, it hasn't happened. So this is good news. Poland is another example. There will almost certainly be elections in September or October. And it's a very high probability that the right-wing government will finally lose control, and we will have a very pro-European government. So Poland, for instance, may become the Eurozone. It could become the Eurozone country in it anyway, because the economic situation is very good, general in comparison. And the same is with other countries. But some countries like Holland, and you're right, Germany, this is a different thing. But I think Germany is in the process of big reassessment, who they are and what they are for in Europe. And they have really burned their fingers in the process. You may remember the common energy policy that was supposed to be sacrosanct, and those who proposed that, which proposed that, the Germans, were absolutely not abiding to it. It is a grotesque thing that Germany, who should be the stalwart of the European policies on behalf of all Europeans, behave in that way. And there is the soul searching now in Germany to come up with some answers, not for just this period, but for a longer period. What is the role of Germans in Europe? Are they too pacifistic? Probably they ended with it because they will raise the defense budget, and they will acknowledge that the role of Germany is to be much more active in the international politics in terms of preserving peace, not just by banners or with banners, but by active policies and participation in the perhaps European joint army, which in my view will happen anyway, which is one of Mrs. Macron point on his agenda for several years.
You mentioned Sweden and Finland. You didn't mention NATO in your presentation. How would the concept of a European Federation mesh with that of NATO?
Well, it's an excellent question, because if you think how the society in Finland and Sweden has changed in just 2 months, this is what will happen in other countries, perhaps because of the war. And I'm talking about Sweden and Finland, not only because of their participation in NATO, potential participation, but that the citizens of these countries will also reassess their role in the European Union and what the European Union is for, that it is not a global power, and that is the problem. So it will be easier for these countries also to accept, at least the citizens, the notion of a European Federation. Don't you think so?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
And for two reasons. One, of course, it's true that large numbers of people, an important slice of the population in Sweden and Finland, has changed its mind about NATO membership. But there was always substantial minorities in favor of NATO membership. It's not quite as big a revolutionary change as perhaps you imply. And I think the more likely outcome is that having joined NATO, the Swedes and the Finns will conclude, let us invest our security in that organization rather than go to another organization in 2 or 3 years' time. I think the desire to bed down in NATO, if anything, would be a disincentive and a barrier against Sweden and Finland being eager members of a European army or an enhanced European defense force. I'd link that with the point that the neighbors of Russia don't, on the whole, regard themselves, I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, but on the whole, they don't think they've been supported as much as they might have been by their Western neighbors, by Germany, France, Italy. They've been supported economically, but not necessarily in hard military terms. I think that there's work to be done in reconciling a number of countries within the European Union to the idea that their security is dependent on the European Union rather than on NATO.
You've asked several questions here. So first of all, NATO. I think if Sweden and Finland join NATO, who remains from the European Union, from within the European Union, that is not a NATO member? There's Austria and Luxembourg, I think, and Malta, all right? So 3 countries. If all...
Ireland, sorry.
Ireland. Yes, Ireland. So 4 countries. There will be quite a strong pressure for these countries, although Ireland is on the outside, but Austria is in a slightly different position. So once Finland and Sweden join, there will be almost, at least the position of the societies in these countries will change, and they will accept that it's probably safer to be in NATO. And if this happens, that all the European Union members are in NATO, it's a foregone conclusion. And why each of them should be a member of NATO and not the whole European Union? That leads to the common defense and common European Union army. So I think that is probably the easiest thing to explain. Now, regarding the attitude of the societies in Sweden and Finland to other matters, that's equally important, and that they will change their mind, I think, because, for example, the energy policies. There are new pipelines going to be built very, very quickly, within months, on the year or 2, and the new LNG gas stations for the European Union as a whole becoming independent. And there are other areas. The more we go, the further we go in towards the end of this decade, the more frequently we will face phenomenal challenges for each of the countries. Think about the technological unemployment, which very few people talk about. But this is just around the corner. The unemployment and unbelievable scale, inflation, and so on. So together we are stronger, and that will probably be the message that will finally get the citizens of those more cautious European Union members to prefer to be in the strong state rather than a weak one that's stay on the international stage.
Curiously, I think that in some ways it may be easier to gain public support for a defense community rather than for a common foreign policy, because foreign policy is a much broader, a much more diffuse set of relationships, which are very divisive between individual countries. Individual countries have different views, have always have, about relations with China, for instance, or relations with the United States, relations with South America, privileged relations in Spain, for instance. Do you think it's going to be possible for this European Federation in the foreseeable future, in the near future, to be able to agree to what Maxime Macron says he wants, the abandonment of the national veto in foreign policy, which is not so much actually a national veto, it's a national government veto. It's the opportunity for presidents and prime ministers to give press releases, to go up and down airplane steps, looking important in foreign policy. Well, what about common foreign policy? Isn't that a stumbling block to what you're talking about?
Well, short answer is I entirely agree with you. That's why I think that the European Federation of 27 currently is almost impossible. And that's why only some will make it, like they made into the Eurozone. Not everybody, not every country went there. Regarding the European policy, even if there weren't a federation, I think one of the most certain, I use this word certain too often perhaps, but this is my method of provoking you to say why not. So one of the policies that I think stand the best chance to be implemented very, very fast is this end of the unanimous voting. It just cannot stand. The only country that we have
foreign policy, for foreign policy.
Well, it will have to cover everything. Yes, you may be right that there will be certain exclusion, but if these exclusions are so important, like you say, foreign policy, there is no way that the countries that think, okay, we will have the same foreign policy towards the Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean countries, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, Libya, that's the France, or even Lebanon in the future, or Israel, you can think of it. So the majority has to be there, not the unanimity. And therefore, I think some of the European Union countries will not agree to that. They may agree to majority voting in most, and the number of areas where majority voting has been accepted is growing by month. But these are the most important one, and the common president. Yeah, a single president which is elected in a pan-European elections. So these two issues may be the stumbling block for some of the European countries not to join those that avant-garde of the European Federation, whatever the name is. So I agree with you that not everybody makes that, but the situation will essentially, like with the Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the situation will enforce that.
One question makes the point that the bonds which have been issued to fight the pandemic, and which might form the basis of a European budget, can't be divided into zones. They're based on the credit of the existing European Union. Is it really going to be possible to unscramble financially the omelette of the European Union in the way that you suggest? A supplementary question there. Aren't you concerned that such people as Draghi are very skeptical of this idea of zones? He seems to be very eager that what he calls pragmatic federalism should be practiced at the level of the whole European Union, not just of a zone within it.
Yeah, this is a very important statement of the politician for whom I have a lot of sympathy. I think he's done a very good job at the Eurobank. But well, that's one of the reasons why the European Union will split into zones. So Mr. Draghi contradicts himself, because if he is for a federation, then the federation has to have its common budget, not just 1%, but perhaps 20% of the GDP. And that would be required to finance defense, health, and other policies. And for the same reason, those who are reluctant to follow that example, for instance, then they have to stay and wait for another time when they will be pressed to finally join the European Federation.
But how many countries are there that in the foreseeable future will be willing to devote 20% of their public expenditure to a European federation?
Well, if you think about the defense budget, health budget combined, just these two, there will be more than 10% of the GDP already. And then the current programs, which are around up to 2%. So it's already 12%. And then the repayment of the debts and some other things in education. So you very quickly come to 20%.
Well, that's
or 15%. Yeah. Well, I'm not saying that this is a sacrosanct figure that 20% must be there, but I'm talking about significant amount, not just 2%. No state can function with 2% of GDP.
Yes, but that's to restate the problem in a different way. The European Union functions on 1.5 or 2% because national governments, supported, it must be said, largely at the moment by public opinion, are reluctant to pool more than that 1.5 or 2%. Why would, other than in truly catastrophic circumstances, a large number of national governments be willing, particularly in the timescale that you put forward, to pool their resources to that broad extent that you advocate?
The answer is it's cheaper. Think about the 3% on defense, right? Why each country has to have a 3% on defense when there is a common army? Let's put that 3% into the common pot, and we'll buy much more for that. That's one answer. The health, if you take example of France or Germany, that can be between 9 and 10% of GDP. So you've got already 13%. Education, to a large extent, may be subsidizing some European Union program. I'm not saying that you spend, say, a percentage of GDP on the common education, perhaps less. So there are policies that will be cheaper to finance than being on their own. If you are within the federation, it would be illogical to join a federation and expect that you will still have your own army, or, for instance, your unemployment support scheme, or the unified minimum wage, which may actually be applied. This is a lot of rumors going on in the European Union that may be applied to all the European countries to perhaps stem the flow of migrants within the European Union. France is essentially, especially concerned about that. But do you think about the cost of the unified minimum wage? where the Eastern and Central European countries will benefit most, these are the countries which also have the lowest external debt. So it's quid pro quo. If you mutualize debts, because that's what the Federation would do, that we are in it together. And this is, for some countries, this will be a fantastic news, that the burden of debt is suddenly lower. So there, and I'm not saying in any sense that all the members of the European Union will join that federation for various reasons. And the societies, like in Ireland, may have different agenda. Ireland was for quite, well, for what, 20 years, trying to fight the right for its own tax rate, corporate tax rate, in order to attract business to its own shores. And other countries may have different reasons for in different areas of policy. And therefore, it will be a balance why some countries will decide to join the European Federation or stay behind. But in the end, if there is, as I said, minimum 9 members, there have to be 9 members. At the moment, if you count those which oppose straightforward the Federation, there are 13 countries. So 14 countries at the moment are for or are not opposed to Federation.
That's an important distinction. It's an important
not
distinction.
Opposed to Federation, but there are more than 9.
Yeah. Can we slightly change the focus? There was a phrase you used during your presentation about humanity possibly losing control of its future. Can you say a bit more about what you meant by that, and particularly dwell on the role of artificial intelligence in that? You stressed the supposed risks to humanity from artificial intelligence. Can you say a bit more about those two, I suppose, interrelated subjects?
Yes, this is something that no politician wants to talk about. And that's why you don't hear it on the radio or media and so on. And in Britain, there was the first exception to that absence of talk seriously of the danger. And I'm talking mostly about the danger of artificial intelligence, creating a malevolent artificial intelligence, not about the benefits which it can contribute to humanity, because that is almost obvious. Why is that? Because if such a politician goes during the election and, for instance, proclaims that, you know, you have to support me because you don't realize how dangerous this artificial intelligence is. Vote on me. What would that voter say? You must be mad. People won't accept that. And that was an illuminating series of lectures by Professor Stuart Russell on BBC4 earlier this year, where he was talking very seriously and addressing it mainly to politicians and media at large, how serious the problem is. However, he didn't spell out what is the cut-off, probable cut-off, and we are talking about probabilities, not certainties, cut-off date by when humans may lose control over superintelligence. By that, I mean that we have probably a decade when we can form the future artificial intelligence. We are not talking about robots. We are talking about systems like internet, global, right? So we have about a decade to indoctrinate such an artificial intelligence in our values, in our preferences. So there's a good chance that when it gets loose, after 2030 roughly, it will learn on the principles and values that are dear to our own. And that's why it is so dangerous if we do not have a global control over that delivery. And there is none. This is a big and separate subject, and even most scientists, AI scientists, don't talk about that because they don't want to stick their head of the parliament, because of the parapet, because they may lose their budgetary contributions from the government. I mean, it sounds cynical, but unfortunately, this is how the world works. So you may remember that by 2015, almost nothing serious was done in the area of climate change. Why? Because no date was specified. When in Paris in 2015, the date 2030 was specified as the most probable cut-off date when we lose control over the global warming, and then there was 1.5% temperature increase defined as a threshold, then suddenly we've got plenty of money. And in Glasgow, it was only re-emphasized. The same is with artificial intelligence. We have to be very specific that these two, very serious for human survival, for human species survival, those serious existential risks are so important. And the reason why I am so adamant that there must be a global organization, such as a Federated European Union, which would take charge of these existential risks, is so important.
There are a couple of members of the audience who have their hands up.
Right.
I'm not quite sure whether they want to speak. Catherine Morehouse has got her hand up. Why don't I allow Catherine Morehouse to speak, and she can tell us what it was that she had her hand up about. Catherine.
Sorry, Brendan, I hit the wrong button. You can't hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Can't hear you?
Yeah, you can't hear me.
It's a bad line.
I hit the wrong bloody button.
You pressed the wrong button.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Thanks very much, Catherine.
You're welcome. Thank you, Brendan.
Is Monica Threlful in the same category as having pressed the wrong button? I'll allow Monica to speak and see whether that's true.
You're muted.
I'll unmute Monica. If Monica's got a further question to ask, perhaps she could put it in chat.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Yes. Monica?
Yes, I can. I have unmuted. Have I not?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, fine. I can't see myself there, but anyway. Yeah, it was about to ask. Why did you think that unemployment, technological unemployment, was going to be grow exponentially, when I thought the talk was that we're actually, well, in the United Kingdom, there's a lot of talk about the fact that unemployment is low and falling because there are so many small jobs being created. And supposedly the environmental threat is also this opportunity to create a vast amount of new efforts to improve the environment, which are both technologically advanced as well as employing a lot of manpower or person power. And I imagine also the moon going outer space is also seems to be an area in which there's a lot of expectation of growth, of interest, of activity, and so on. So what is your version of this inevitable growth in unemployment?
Yes, thank you, Monica. I think it's a very good question. And we have to distinguish between ephemeral trends about which politicians very nicely talk about, like that we have a high employment, or that we will have low inflation. If you go back just a year or less than a year in the UK, what the governor of the Bank of England was saying, look where we are now. These trends that we see now will disappear. I'm talking about longer term trends, almost without any change in that trend. and the artificial intelligence will cause that many jobs that are currently being done by not just manual, but even if in the most sophisticated areas like neurosurgeons, right? Neurosurgeons, lawyers, and teachers, to some extent, in the next decade, if you look at the forecast, will largely disappear. There will be only 10% of the lawyers in 2030 than they are now. So what about so it's not addressed to the, the lawyers. I'm only giving an example. Accountants, the same thing, 10%. Think how many of us are doing the tax ourselves online and how easy it is. So that's the trend that I'm talking about. It would happen much earlier hadn't we a pandemic and in the UK Brexit. Now the dependence, for instance, on China, where most of the jobs went there because the differential between the cost of production in the US and China, say 20, 30 years ago, was 1 to 10. Now it's 1 to 3. But in the areas of robotization, like for instance, making mobile phones, there is hardly any difference. And you can easily put those robots in the UK or in the States, and you don't need too many people, and you still have the products. And that is the trend that will be rising even faster. So that's what I'm talking about, the unemployment. As far as the risk for the society is concerned, is that these moves in the unemployment caused by technology, which is unfortunately the wrong side of its impact on society, will increase when other areas of other risks or threats may also appear, not just say arising from geopolitical role of China or Russia, but in other areas. So that's why I'm concerned about the technological unemployment, and we will be wise to prepare for it in advance.
Monica's still got her hand up. Are you satisfied with the answer? Yes, I think Monica is. There's one participant who's asked a number of questions, and I'm not sure if all the questions that he asked have been answered. So I'm going to give Mr. Chandler the opportunity to speak if he wishes to, and then Tony, I'll ask you to wrap up. Mr. Chandler, is there anything you want to contribute to the discussion?
Hello, yeah. Okay, well, just really what's in the thread, you know, that I kind of split it up because I realized my first question was rather long. But I'm generally in favor, living in Hungary, of a confederation which kind of respects each country's right to make its own domestic policy. But I think the role that the EU needs to play in the future is one of providing a consistent common foreign policy, despite what you said, Brendan, which I acknowledge. I don't think you can actually separate out, and I think Ukraine shows this, defense from security, from foreign policy, and certainly from a Hungarian perspective, with so many borders around us, you know, they're certainly not separate issues. They weren't separate issues in the election campaign, which incidentally, you know, I've put here that Viktor Orban won by two contradictory positions, really crazy positions of actually, you know, anti-European propaganda on the one hand, and his so-called success in economic policies as a result largely of EU funding, you know, and I think really, you know, the EU needs to get its act together and scrutinize what it's actually doing in Central Eastern Europe on a long-term basis, because this issue in Ukraine goes back to 2014, if not before. But we've also had the migration issue as well since 2015 with Hungary, which, as far as I'm aware, has never been resolved, and it could come back at any point with an exodus of refugees, not just from Eastern Europe but from Africa as well. My solution would really be to kind of redirect attention away from NATO. I mean, I think NATO is fine at the moment, but what about Afghanistan? What about if Trump comes back in, and proposes to cut US spending? I think Europe would be much better placed if it had a common foreign policy and a security operation, which at the moment is conducted through NATO, which is conducted by the EU, albeit in conjunction with NATO. And I also think that makes sense in terms of the world, because you've got, the US could pay more attention to China, as it's already doing, and the Far East. We don't get this absurdity of the UK getting involved in what's happening out there.
Quite a lot of points there. Can we put?
Okay, no, that's it. Basically, what I'm saying is an EU confederation with foreign policy should replace many of the roles that NATO currently has. And that would also help with the funding, because if the funding went to the EU rather than NATO from European countries, that would help to realize what you're talking about. Sorry.
Tony, thank you very much, Mr. Chandler. Thank you for your contribution.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for firming up your question so briefly at the end. I am wholeheartedly with you. I think it's that the EU should have its own army, and that army should be part of NATO. It would be much cheaper, much more effective, and it would additionally be a formidable factor in uniting the European citizens at practical level. Think about the soldiers from different countries serving in the same one army. Now, regarding the foreign policy, the same is true. The European Union or European Federation needs a common European foreign policy. Otherwise, it won't be treated seriously. It should have one president that will be on par with the United States president or Chinese president or Russian president. Otherwise, the European Union will have the same problems as it has at the moment.
Good. Are there any final remarks you want to make, Tony?
Yes, I would like to make a step back and think about the European Federation in the global context. I already hinted in my last short response that I think the European Union has proved in the last perhaps 10 years that it can stand as a formidable de facto government. I give you only one example. Think about GDPR policy. Who would have thought that a legislation that was only aimed at the European Union members would within months be adopted by nearly all countries in the world? I'm talking about cookies, for instance, right? The privacy law. And there is another law, that legislation that will affect artificial intelligence in the most serious way that the United Nations even haven't dreamt about. There are so many good things happening in the European Union. And of course, the British press would not report about this. And this is boring stuff, but this is extremely important, not just for the survival of the European Union, but survival of us as a human species. And globally, looking at that, the world needs a new organization that would be a real power, global power, not just, a peace-making organization as the United Nations, which is necessary, but it hasn't got any clout, any power to implement its own policies, even in the area of AI. So that's why the reason for establishing the European Federation is so powerful and so necessary.
Thank you very much. Can I just make one observation at the end, which is that the term federation doesn't figure in the Treaty of Rome and the European treaties, but the phrase ever closer union does. And there's a reason for that, because that is the way that the European Union has been set up until now, that it would proceed, as it were, from the bottom up. The ever closer union would take place incrementally. What you're hypothesizing is something which is not merely revolutionary, but revolutionary in terms of the European Union. And
Yes.
it may be that events, as you say, have speeded up, and history stands still for decades, and then decades of change occur in a few weeks. Those who live longest will know most. We'll get you back sometime before 2024 to see how it's going. Thank you very much. Thank you
very
to
much.
all the audience, and
Thank you.
have a good evening. And I hope to see many of you at other Federal Trust events in the near future. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, Tony.
Thank you.